As the Trump administration executes a controversial crackdown on immigration, European leaders are also facing their own migrant crisis. There have been intense discussions over the past several weeks about exactly how to manage the number of people fleeing to the European Union. And this comes as the populist government in Italy has refused to accept ships carrying migrants. German Chancellor Angela Merkel has also been forced to toughen her own immigration policy in order to maintain the support of her regional allies. For more, I want to bring in Washington Post Berlin Bureau Chief Griff Witte. He's in Washington. Griff, when exactly did immigration start becoming a really big issue for the European Union, and why has it particularly gotten so contentious in recent weeks?
Well, we all remember what happened in 2005, in the autumn of 2005, when you had this sudden surge in the number of people who were trying to make their way to Europe. And at the time, the people were primarily coming via Greece. They were leaving Turkey, coming in via the Greek islands. There was a deal struck in 2016, early 2016, that really stemmed those flows, and the numbers decreased quite dramatically after that. They're still down well below what they were at the peak of this situation. There's been no sudden surge lately, but what there has been is a increased political focus on the issue. You have new governments in Italy, in Austria, that are vowing a much, much tougher line on immigration. They're vowing to close down the Mediterranean entirely for asylum seekers who are trying to make their way to Europe. And that's caused problems for people like Angela Merkel, who have maintained a policy of trying to be accommodating to refugees, to true asylum seekers.
You know, Griff, you mentioned Italy and Austria. We've seen this rise of nationalism in several countries in Europe, including those countries as well. You know, Europe's been struggling economically. How much of economics is really at play here?
Well, Europe actually is doing okay economically. You've seen growth return to Europe in a pretty significant way in the past year. Even an economy like Greece's, which had been deep in the doldrums. This was a country that had been absolutely ravaged by the aftermath of the Great Recession. It's bouncing back. The Italian economy has bounced back some. I don't think that this is primarily an economic driven crisis. I think this is really politicians who are capitalizing on the feeling of unease that a lot of Europeans feel with people from Africa, people from the Middle East, people from South Asia coming to Europe, not in any kind of sudden surge like we saw a few years ago, but just in steady flows. And there's just unease about what that means for cultural change in Europe. And there are politicians who are playing on that anxiety, playing on those concerns, and also are whipping up a lot of fears.
When you talk about those fears that are being played on, earlier this week we saw German Chancellor Angela Merkel reach an immigration deal with other European leaders to sort of prevent the breakup of her own government. What do we know about that deal, Griff?
Well, this was a deal that Angela Merkel did not want to make. She was basically threatened by her own interior minister, who is the leader of the Bavarian sister party to Merkel's own party. The interior minister, Horst Seehofer, said basically, accept my migration plan or else I'm out of here. I'm quitting, and I may be taking my party too, which would be the demise of Merkel's government. Merkel said, no, let's talk about this. Let's do a deal. This was for a couple of weeks there, a real standoff in German politics, a crisis for the country where people didn't know whether this government was going to survive. It has survived. Merkel has survived. She has led the country for 13 years, and her position is once again, at least for now, it's stable. But longer term, she is going to continue to face these big challenges. The CSU, the Bavarian sister party, wants to take a much, much tougher line on immigration than she's comfortable with. She's had to make a lot of concessions to them with this latest deal involving turning people back at the border, enacting new checks along the border to prevent people from entering into German territory. And so I think Merkel is going to continue to come under pressure from her right flank, from people who feel that she's not being tough enough. And she's trying to maintain this posture of refugees welcome and people who are genuinely seeking asylum should have a place to go. But that's a harder line to maintain in Europe than it has been than it was a few years ago, because the attitude has hardened. People are much more hostile to refugees and migrants than they were a few years ago.
Griff, you mentioned that hostility. We know President Trump falsely tweeted that crime is actually up in Germany by 10% because of Merkel and her policies to openly accept migrants. How has his tweets and his rhetoric affected sort of the politics within Europe?
Well, I think they actually, counterintuitively, they help Merkel, because Trump is so unpopular in a country like Germany. About 85% of Germans dislike him. Only about 15% or so of Germans approve of him. So when he attacks Merkel and says crime is way up, which is false, crime is actually at the lowest point in decades, and when he says that immigration is causing these huge problems, obviously there is a constituency for that. There are people who agree with it, but by and large, Germans feel that Trump is misguided on immigration and that he doesn't have Germany's interests at heart. And so when he attacks Merkel and says she's taking the country in a bad direction, I think there's something of a rallying around her that takes place where Germans say, we've got to support our chancellor and not give in to pressure from President Trump.
You recently reported on Germany's treatment of migrants and that they've been held in shelters that are very similar to prisons. What can you tell us about the conditions they face and the conditions they're being held in?
Well, Germany, as I mentioned, had this policy of refugees welcome for several years, where they tried as best they could to accommodate people, and really, they didn't want to concentrate people in holding facilities that were apart from communities. They wanted to integrate people into communities where they would ultimately settle. And I think what has happened is there's a diminishing appetite for that, and people are now demanding that asylum seekers, people who are unlikely to achieve asylum, who are unlikely to get protection because they may come from countries where acceptance of asylum seekers, rates of acceptance are relatively low. Countries like Nigeria, for instance, where most people who are applying for asylum don't ultimately get asylum. A lot of these people are now being housed in what are known as anchor centers, and these are centers that are very much apart from the community. They're not integrated into the community. These people who are living there aren't given German language lessons. They're not given the opportunity to work. They're not even given the opportunity to cook meals for themselves. So they have to eat meals every day in a cafeteria-style facility. They don't get a lot of privacy. They're housed together in these sort of dorm-style barracks. And if you are living there for a week or a couple of weeks, it's fine. If you're living there for 8, 9, 10 months, which is true of a lot of these people who have small children in many cases, they're tough places to live, and there's a lot of unhappiness and a sense that people have made very, very long journeys in search of protection, and they're not getting the lives that they had hoped for in Germany.
You know, at one point, European leaders agreed to screen migrants in North Africa for asylum eligibility before they even reach Europe. Is that still the plan, and what do we expect to happen next?
Well, that is something that's being pushed very hard by, say, an Austrian Chancellor, Sebastian Kurz, who has argued for a much tougher line on immigration and has said, effectively, we don't want to deal with this problem in Europe. We want to outsource this problem to the Middle East, to Asia, to North Africa, and make authorities there deal with it in cooperation with European officials. And I think that over time, initially that was an idea that was rejected. There was a sense that Europe has to take responsibility for this. Lebanon, for instance, is a country that has taken in more refugees than all of Europe combined in recent years. So there was a sense before that Europe had to do its fair share. There were multiple crises on Europe's doorstep, and Europe should be doing more. Well, with the hardening of public attitudes, I think there's growing support for this idea of outsourcing the problem, dealing with it in places like North Africa. Now, it's much more, once you agree on that as European leaders, that's one thing, but you have to get North African leaders also to agree, and that's a much more complicated situation. And so, we're a long way from actually having a system where the problem is outsourced, but that is the ultimate goal of courts and other immigration hardliners.
Griff Witte with the Washington Post. Griff, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you, Rena.